My father-in-law fired me from his company. I owned 34% of it. The day Gerald Hutchins fired me, he was wearing a bolo tie with a turquoise stone the size of a quail egg, and I remember thinking, only a man who has never once been held accountable for anything owns jewelry that confident. He sat across from me in a leather chair that cost more than my first car, in a corner office on the 14th floor of a building with his family's name on the side, and he said, with the particular gentleness of someone who has rehearsed this, "Mara, I think it's time we restructure your role," which is a sentence that means nothing and everything simultaneously, the corporate equivalent of, "It's not you, it's me," delivered by a man who absolutely means it's you. What he did not say, because Gerald Hutchins had never in his 71 years on this earth been required to confront an uncomfortable fact directly, was this: I owned 34% of the company he was firing me from. 34%. Let that settle. Not a token stake. Not a courtesy slice handed to the boss's daughter-in-law to keep the peace at Thanksgiving. 34% of Hutchins Energy Services, a Dallas-based oilfield services company that in the prior fiscal year had posted revenues of $218 million. I had earned that equity, structured it legally, and held it in my name. And Gerald Hutchins, a man who genuinely believed that firing someone was a thing you could do to a person who owned a third of your company, looked me in the eyes and told me to clean out my desk by Friday. So here's the question I want you to hold on to from the very beginning, because I'm going to answer it eventually, and the answer is going to be more satisfying than you expect. How do you fire someone who owns the building? I need to back up, because this story doesn't start in a corner office. It starts the way most catastrophic things in my life start, with me being too smart for a room and not realizing I should have kept it to myself. My name is Mara Hutchins, formerly Mara Delgado, and I want you to notice that I still use his family's name, which is its own kind of precision instrument, and we'll get to why. I grew up in Garland, which is the kind of Dallas suburb that people from Dallas describe as not really Dallas, when they want you to understand that they're from the kind of Dallas that has a Porsche dealership. My mother worked in hospital billing. My father drove long haul until his knees gave out. I was the first person in my family to finish a 4-year degree, and I did it in 3 because I was impatient and slightly insufferable. And then I got an MBA from UT Austin, because I had read enough business case studies to understand that the people who structured deals were the ones who ended up owning things. I met Daniel Hutchins in 2013 at a conference in Houston. He was presenting a panel on family business succession, which I attended because I was 26 and curious, and did not yet know that attending a panel called Family Business Succession, when you are a single woman, would later be described by a divorce attorney as the inciting incident. Daniel was handsome in a particular way, the way of men who have always had enough money that they never developed the anxious, scanning quality that the rest of us carry around. He was kind. He laughed easily. He introduced me to his father at dinner that night, and Gerald Hutchins shook my hand with both of his and said, "Danny talks about you all the time," which was a lie, because we had met 40 minutes earlier. But Gerald was the kind of man who made you feel like a known quantity even when he was inventing you on the spot. We got married in 2015. Church wedding, 240 guests, orchids flown in from somewhere tropical, the full production. My mother cried. His mother, Patricia, air-kissed my cheek and said my dress was timeless, which I have since learned is what wealthy Dallas women say about things they find unfashionable. I was 32. I was in love. I was also, and this is the part that matters, formally joining a family business that had been hemorrhaging operational efficiency for a decade, because Gerald Hutchins believed that if something had worked in 1987, it would work forever. The arrangement was Gerald's idea, which is the first thing you need to understand about him. Gerald was not a stupid man. He was a proud man, which is a different thing and often more dangerous. He saw in me what Daniel had fallen in love with: someone organized, analytical, relentless about process. He offered me a position as VP of Operations 6 months after the wedding, and he structured it with an equity vesting schedule that would land me at 34% after 7 years of continuous service and meeting a set of defined performance benchmarks. "I want you invested," he told me, over a stake at Pappas Brothers, and he meant it the way men like Gerald always mean financial things: literally, completely, and without any emotional scaffolding whatsoever. "I want you to notice that I met every single benchmark. Every one. I want you to notice that because later, when Gerald told various people that my departure was performance-related, I had documentation in a binder with tabs. I am the kind of person who has a binder with tabs. This is both my greatest strength and, if I'm being honest, one of the reasons the marriage started developing hairline fractures around year 4. There is a specific kind of loneliness in being the most organized person in every room you enter. You start to feel less like a partner and more like infrastructure. Let me tell you what Hutchins Energy Services actually does, because if you don't understand the business, you don't understand the fight. HES is a mid-sized oil field services company. They provide equipment maintenance, well site logistics, and technical consulting to operators across the Permian Basin and Eagle Ford Shale. Gerald's father started it in 1961 as a pump repair shop out of Odessa. Gerald grew it into something real in the 80s, when the Texas oil economy was printing money, and you could grow a services company by simply answering the phone faster than your competitors. By the time I arrived, the company had a solid reputation and a deeply dysfunctional back office. Their field technician scheduling ran on a system so old that 2 of our IT vendors had refused to support it on the grounds that it was technically archaeology. Their contract renewal rate was 71%, when industry standard hovered around 85%. Gerald knew these things. He did not like knowing them. He especially did not like that his daughter-in-law had compiled a slide deck about them. The thing about Dallas in October, and this is important because half of this story takes place in Dallas in October, which is the city's one truly beautiful month, is that the air gets a quality to it that doesn't exist anywhere else. The humidity breaks, and something almost cool moves in from the north, and the light at 4 in the afternoon turns that specific amber that makes even the tollway look like it has artistic merit. I used to drive back from field visits in that light, listening to nothing, feeling like the work was real and the work was good. That feeling is worth naming because it didn't survive what happened next, and I want you to understand what was actually lost. I spent 3 years rebuilding the operational core of that company, replaced the scheduling system, renegotiated 14 vendor contracts, brought the contract renewal rate to 89% in 18 months, implemented a predictive maintenance protocol that reduced emergency callouts, which are extraordinarily expensive, and the thing field operators hate most, by 31%. Gerald attended the board presentations where these numbers were reported. He nodded. He said things like, "Good work," the way people say, "Bless your heart," in the South. Which is to say, the words are technically complimentary, and the intent is up for debate. The real tension, though, and here is the first medium loop I want you to keep open, was not about my performance. It was about what came next. Gerald was 71. He had 1 son. That son had married me. And somewhere in the previous 3 years, a conversation had started, not in any meeting room, not in any documented exchange, but in the particular silence between a patriarch and his heir, about who was actually going to run this company after Gerald was gone. Daniel and I had talked about it. Of course we had. Daniel wanted to run operations with me. He said this. He was sincere. Daniel is one of the most genuinely sincere people I have ever met, which made what happened later feel less like betrayal and more like weather, a thing that moved through and reshaped the landscape without malice, without intention, without any particular understanding of what it had done. The marriage started ending in the spring of year 5, which puts us at 2020, which is not a year anyone needs me to characterize at length. Stress does clarifying work on relationships. It took everything soft and burned it away and left the structural questions standing in the open air. What do we actually want? Do we want the same things? Do we want each other? Or do we want the version of each other that existed before we understood the full cost? I want to be fair here. Daniel did not fall out of love with me exactly. He fell into the orbit of his father's expectations, which is a gravitational field strong enough to reshape most things that enter it. I watched it happen. I filed it in a different kind of binder, the kind you keep in your chest, the one that has no tabs because you don't actually want to find anything in there quickly. By January 2022, Daniel and I were living in the same house in Lakewood with the quiet, organized distance of two professionals who have agreed not to make anything worse before they figure out what to do. I was still running operations. The company was performing better than it had in a decade and a half. Gerald had started, and I noticed this the way you notice a change in barometric pressure, including people in operational conversations who had not previously been included. His nephew, Travis, who had the organizational aptitude of decorative gravel, and a man named Roy Beecham who had been Gerald's college roommate, and seemed to have been hired primarily on the strength of that credential. The second medium loop. Watch Roy Beecham. He will matter more than you think. The turning point, and I mean the actual turning point, the moment when the story I thought I was living was replaced by the story I was actually in, happened on a Tuesday in March 2022, at a board meeting I was not supposed to know about. Hutchins Energy Services had a 5-person board at this stage. Gerald, Daniel, an outside director named Helen Park, who was a former energy attorney, and the only person in the room I trusted entirely, and 2 additional independents who were, to be diplomatic about it, gentlemen of a certain vintage who attended quarterly meetings and deferred to Gerald on everything with the consistency of a physical law. I had no board seat. This was, I had been assured repeatedly, a temporary condition that would be addressed as my equity vested fully, a sentence I had heard so many times it had started to feel like a ringtone. What I learned through Helen, who called me on a Wednesday evening in a tone that suggested she was standing somewhere private, was that the Tuesday meeting had included a discussion item that appeared on no official agenda, a proposed amendment to the company's shareholder agreement that would have converted my equity class from voting shares to non-voting preferred stock. I want to let that sentence exist for a moment before I continue. Non-voting preferred stock is the financial equivalent of giving someone a seat at a table and then bolting the chair to the floor and removing their silverware. You hold an economic interest. You receive dividends if any are declared. You have approximately the political influence of a houseplant. Gerald wanted to convert 34% of the voting equity in his company, equity that was in my name, equity that had been earned and documented and legally structured, into something decorative. Helen had blocked it. She had done this on procedural grounds, citing a required notice period and the absence of proper documentation, which bought time but did not resolve the fundamental fact. Gerald Hutchins was trying to strip my voice from the company before I finished vesting, and he was doing it with the kind of careful, quiet efficiency that suggested he had been thinking about it for quite some time. I sat in my car in the parking garage of our Lakewood house, the house that technically belonged to both of us, the house with the kitchen I had renovated, and the garden I had maintained, and the guest room I had been sleeping in for 4 months. and I felt something I want to describe precisely, because imprecision would be disrespectful to the feeling. It was not rage. Rage is hot and immediate and announces itself. This was cold. It was the sensation of every ambient assumption I had been carrying about good faith and functional relationships draining quietly away, leaving behind something clear and hard and very, very still. It felt, if I am being completely honest, like relief. Like, oh, so that's what this is. Now I know. I called no one that night. I opened my laptop. I made tea, jasmine green, because I was not going to perform a crisis I hadn't fully mapped yet. And I spent 4 hours reading every document that governed my equity position. The shareholder agreement, the vesting schedule, the company's articles of incorporation, the operating agreement, my employment contract. I made notes in a new document. I went to bed at 2 a.m, and I slept better than I had in 6 months, which should tell you something about the restorative properties of clarity. Here is what those documents told me, and here is where I want to introduce the question that will only be answered much later, so hold it. The documents told me that my shares were voting shares. Full stop. They told me that the proposed conversion would require my explicit written consent to execute, a consent that would, clearly, never be forthcoming. They told me that, as a 34% holder, I held a blocking position on any shareholder vote that required a supermajority, which under the company's articles included major asset dispositions, significant debt issuances, and certain strategic partnerships. They told me that the employment agreement which connected my ongoing equity vesting to my continued employment was written broadly enough to be challenged, particularly if termination were found to be in bad faith. And then they told me something Gerald apparently had not thought through, which was this. Under the company's shareholder agreement, a buyout of my stake, in the event that the parties could not agree on terms, would be valued by an independent appraiser at fair market value, with no minority discount applied. No minority discount. This not standard. This was, almost certainly, an oversight in the original drafting, or perhaps Gerald in 2015, when he structured this arrangement and felt magnanimous and confident and certain that I would be part of this family forever, had not thought to include it, because he assumed it would never matter. The question, the one I will answer in Act 5. What does 34% of Hutchins Energy Services actually cost, at fair market value with no minority discount, when someone has spent 3 years making it worth a great deal more than it was? I went to sleep on that question. It kept warm. Gerald fired me on April 7, 2022. The bolo tie has already been documented. The leather chair has already been documented. What I want to add, because the sensory record matters, is the smell of his office. Old paper, something floral from a plug-in air freshener positioned near the credenza, and underneath it, the faint industrial note of a man who had come up through the field and still, even after 4 decades behind a desk, carried a trace of it. His office faced northwest and caught the afternoon light directly, and on that particular April afternoon it was flooding in behind him, which meant I was squinting slightly through our entire conversation and he was backlit, which I have since decided was either a deliberate power move or an accident that he would have approved of had it been deliberate. Mara, I think it's time we restructure your role. I said. What does that mean, Gerald? He said. And I want you to note the precision of this evasion. We feel like the operational division has matured to a point where the needs have changed. We, I said. He adjusted the bolo tie. The family. The board. Daniel. A pause. This is a business decision. I looked at him for a moment. Outside his window, Dallas did its afternoon thing. The grit of it. The flatness of it. the particular way the light hit the glass towers of downtown and scattered into something almost beautiful. I had lived in this city for 11 years. I had built something real inside the borders of this family and this company, and the man across from me was trying to hand it back to me in an envelope. "I'd like that in writing," I said. He blinked. "Of course. HR will—" "Not from HR," I said. "From you. On letterhead. Signed." Another pause. Gerald Hutchins was a man who had conducted most of his professional life through implication and handshake, and I was asking him to put his fingerprints on something. I watched him recalibrate. "I'll have it prepared," he said. I stood up. I smoothed my jacket. I said, "Thank you for your time," because I had been raised with manners and I was not going to abandon them in the moment they were most inconvenient. And I walked out of his corner office, through the glass doors with the company name etched on them, past the receptionist who looked at me with an expression of exquisite discomfort that suggested she knew exactly what had just happened, and I pressed the elevator button and waited. The elevator opened. I got in. The doors closed. I was alone in a small mirrored box 14 floors above Dallas. I smiled. Not because anything was funny, because I had just been handed a gift so large I could barely see the edges of it, and the man who gave it to me had absolutely no idea. I retained Patricia Ewan on April 9th. Patricia was an Austin-based corporate attorney with a particular specialty in minority shareholder rights and family business disputes, and she had been recommended to me by Helen Park in a text message that said only, "You need Patricia Ewan. Tell her I sent you. Do not negotiate your own equity. I have never received better advice." Our first call lasted 2 hours. I walked her through every document. She was quiet in the specific way of someone who is listening hard, and then she said, "Tell me about the minority discount provision." I told her. A longer quiet. "And this vesting was complete?" "As of March 1st, I said. 34%, fully vested, voting shares. No restrictions on transfer or vote pending the shareholder agreement terms." "And he fired you after the vesting completed." April 7th. I heard her exhale slowly. "Mara," she said, "I want you to understand what I'm about to tell you in the way it is intended, which is professionally and without hyperbole. He handed you the controls. I want to say that I had already understood this. Partially. But hearing it from Patricia, in her careful, precise voice, made it real in a different way. This is perhaps one of my fallibilities, and I offer it honestly. I am good at analysis, and I sometimes need another person to validate what the analysis shows before I believe it fully. I am working on this. Roy Beecham, you will be unsurprised to learn, had been quietly positioned to replace me. He had taken meetings with 3 of our major Permian Basin clients in the 2 weeks following my termination, presenting himself as the new operational lead. This I learned from a field technician named Jose Medrano, who had worked under my supervision for 4 years, and who texted me on a Thursday to say, with his characteristic economy of language, "Beecham was out here today. Clients asking where you are. Thought you should know." I thanked Jose. I made a note. I added it to the binder. Here's what Patricia and I decided, after 3 weeks of calls and document review, and 2 in-person meetings in a conference room in Austin that smelled of cold coffee and focused intent. I would not sell my shares. This is the part that people have the hardest time understanding, because the instinct, when someone has wronged you, is to take the money and go. And there was going to be money. We were already confident of that. Patricia's initial valuation analysis put the company at a conservative range of $190 to $210 million, which meant my 34% was worth, at the low end, $64 million, and at the high end, approximately 71, without a minority discount. Those numbers were sitting there, and Gerald, once he understood them fully, would likely have made me a reasonable offer to go away quietly. I didn't want to go away quietly. This is, I acknowledge, not purely strategic. This is also personal, and I am going to own that without apology, because the entire premise of what he did was that I could be dismissed, structurally, professionally, literally, and that the equity I had earned would be quietly restructured or bought out, and I would return to being a person who had briefly been adjacent to a Hutchins and then ceased to be. I had a different vision. I would vote my shares. Every vote. Every board resolution. Every strategic initiative requiring a supermajority. I would sit at that table, because as a 34% shareholder, they could not prevent me from attending shareholder meetings. And I would exercise every right the documents gave me with the kind of methodical, documented, legally impeccable consistency that could not be characterized as harassment, could not be characterized as bad faith, and could not be stopped. I would not burn anything down. I would simply stop letting anything new get built until the terms were right. The first vote was in June 2022. A proposed credit facility, $35 million in new debt to fund an equipment acquisition program that was, I will grudgingly admit, strategically sound. Gerald needed a supermajority. He needed 67%. He had 66. I voted no. The credit facility died. I received a phone call from Gerald the following morning. He did not open with pleasantries. He said, "Mara, this is petty." I said, "Gerald, this is governance. We need that equipment." "I know," I said. I wrote the acquisition thesis. You'll recall I presented it to the board in February. A silence in which the entire architecture of his miscalculation was present, audible, and apparently settling into him in real time. "What do you want?" he said. "Fair value," I said. "For my shares. No minority discount per the shareholder agreement, an independent appraiser, and a formal acknowledgement, in writing, that my termination was without cause." "That's not—" "The next vote is in August," I said. "The equipment lease renewal, also supermajority." I let that sit for a moment. "Have a good day, Gerald." I hung up. My hands were steady. The tea was jasmine again. The family dinner was Patricia's idea, which surprised me because Patricia is the least sentimental person I have ever encountered in a professional context, and I mean that as the highest compliment. She said, "They will try to resolve this in a family setting before they proceed legally. Let them. You want them to see you in person. People negotiate worse when they've just had dinner." It happened in September. Gerald and Patricia, his wife, not my attorney, hosted at their home in Preston Hollow, a house I had eaten in perhaps 60 times, a house with a kitchen that smelled of the rosemary Patricia Sr. kept in a pot on the windowsill, and the particular wax of a wooden floor that gets polished weekly by someone who cares about it. The dining room had a chandelier that had come from somewhere in Europe, and that Gerald pointed out to every first-time visitor with the satisfaction of a man who has a story ready. I was not a first-time visitor. No one pointed out the chandelier. Daniel was there. We had been technically separated since May, and formally filing since July, and the particular geography of sitting across a dinner table from your soon-to-be ex-husband, while also being in a legal dispute with his father, is a geography I do not recommend to anyone. Daniel looked tired. He had lost some weight. He met my eyes when I sat down and said, quietly, "Hi, Mara." And I said, "Hi, Daniel." And those 4 words contained everything we had ever been and everything we were in the process of not being, compressed into the social convention of a greeting. Gerald's opening, over the first course, a salad that no one was actually eating, was that the company needed stability, that the shareholder dispute was creating operational uncertainty, that clients were noticing. All of this was true. He said it with genuine distress, and I want to be clear about this. I believed him. The distress was real. Gerald Hutchins had spent a significant portion of his life building that company, and watching it stall at every decision point because his daughter-in-law was voting no was genuinely painful for him. I did not feel nothing about that. I felt something about it. I just felt more things about the other things. His wife, Patricia. This is confusing, I know. There are two Patricias. I apologize. Reached across the table and touched my hand at one point and said, "Mara, we want this to be right for everyone." And I looked at her. This woman who had air-kissed my cheek at my wedding and called my dress timeless. And I thought, you mean it. You actually mean it. You've always meant the version of this that lives in your head, where everyone is taken care of and nobody has to say any uncomfortable things out loud. And I felt something almost like tenderness for her, because she was not a villain. None of them were, exactly. They were people who had built a world that worked according to their own rules, and had simply never imagined that someone would show up with the documents. I want what the shareholder agreement specifies, I said. An independent appraisal at fair market value with no minority discount. If the number is what my attorney and I believe it to be, I sell and we're done. If Gerald wants to contest the appraisal methodology, we go to arbitration, which will take 18 months and cost everyone money we don't need to spend. Gerald set down his fork. Daniel said, "Dad?" Gerald looked at his son. Something passed between them that I was not privy to and will not speculate about. I have enough things I was privy to. I don't need the ones I wasn't. "What number are we talking about?" Gerald said. "Around 70 million, I said. Give or take, depending on appraisal. The chandelier above us did its European chandelier thing, entirely indifferent. There was an arbitration threat from Gerald's legal team in October, a Hail Mary argument that the equity structure had been intended as compensation tied to employment, and should therefore be subject to forfeiture upon termination. Patricia, my Patricia, described this motion in a call to me as impressively creative and functionally indefensible, which is attorney for they know they're going to lose but they have to try. She was right. The arbitrator, a retired judge out of Dallas named Clarence Booth, who had the precise energy of a man who had spent 30 years watching rich people argue about money and had arrived at a permanent state of mild contempt for it, dismissed the claim in November after what I am told was an unusually brief deliberation. Roy Beecham, in the meantime, had managed to oversee a service failure on a major Eagle Ford account that cost the company a contract worth $4.2 million annually. I did not cause this. I want to be explicit. I did not engineer this. I did not encourage it. I did not so much as whisper in its direction. Roy Beecham simply was not good at the job, and the job turned out to be a job that required someone good at it. This is not revenge. This is consequence, which is a different and more honest category. Gerald called me himself after the Eagle Ford loss. He did not lead with the loss. He said, "I'd like to resolve this." "I know," I said. "The appraisal," he said. "I'll authorize it." The appraisal came back in January 2023. The appraiser was a firm out of Houston that specialized in energy sector valuations, selected by mutual agreement, bound to the methodology specified in the shareholder agreement. They valued the company at $208 million. 34% of $208 million, with no minority discount applied, is $70.72 million. Gerald's board, under pressure from Helen Park and the independent directors, who had been watching supermajority votes fail for 8 months and were thoroughly tired of the governance paralysis, authorized a buyout at the appraised value. He did not negotiate. He did not counter. He signed. I am told, by someone who was in the room, that he did not speak for quite a long time after he signed, and I have made a decision not to find satisfaction in that, because finding satisfaction in it would require me to imagine his face, and I have enough of Gerald Hutchins's face in my memory to last the rest of my life. The wire transferred in February 2023. $70,720,000, minus taxes, minus Patricia's very reasonable fees, minus the various costs of being a person who goes to war inside a family structure for 11 months and comes out the other side with her name on a settlement. I was 39 years old. I was divorced. I was sitting in a rented apartment in East Dallas with the particular temporary quality of a place that knows it's a placeholder. And I had just become someone with a number attached to her that she was still in the process of understanding. Here's the question I planted in Act 3, the one I promised to answer. What does 34% of Hutchins Energy Services cost at fair market value with no minority discount, when someone has spent 3 years making it worth a great deal more than it was? The answer is $70.72 million. But that is not the real answer. The real answer is, it costs whatever the person who built it decides it's worth. Gerald increased the value of his company by approximately $80 million during the years I ran operations. I know this because I tracked it, because I am the kind of person who tracks these things, because I had known since the first week I walked into that building that the work I was doing was building something that had my fingerprints on it, even if my name wasn't on the door. He got most of that value. He kept the company. He got to hand it to his son. He got to sit in his corner office in Preston Hollow with his European chandelier and his rosemary wife and his turquoise bolo tie. What it cost him was a number, and the number was large, and I will be honest with you. Some mornings I wake up, and I think about how that number is real, and something in me that is not entirely dignified feels exactly as satisfied as it sounds. But here is the confession, the one I promised at the beginning, the one that comes now because the story is almost done, and I have been saving it. I don't know if I won. I won the legal thing. I won the financial thing. I structured the exit the way I said I would, and it executed the way I planned. And Patricia Ewan sent me a bottle of wine when the wire cleared and the note said, "Well played," which is the highest form of praise in that language. The math is clear. The outcome is documented. These things are true. What is also true is that Daniel and I have not spoken since February 2023 except through attorneys, and I do not know if he's all right. What is also true is that Patricia Sr. sent me a card, a physical card, on actual paper, which in the 21st century is an act of genuine effort, that said, "I hope you find peace, Mara." And I held that card for longer than I should have, because it arrived from a woman I never stopped liking even when I was in the middle of legal proceedings against her husband. What is also true is that I drove past the Hutchins Energy Services building on a Tuesday evening in March, a year after everything ended, and I sat in my car in the parking lot across the street and looked at the name on the building, the family name that I still carry, because I kept it for reasons I am still mapping. And I felt something I don't have a clean word for. It wasn't grief. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something that required both and was not quite either. I have started a new company, early stage, small. The kind of thing where you send invoices from a desk in a room you're still setting up, and every decision matters and nothing is inherited. This is the right thing. I know it's the right thing. But here is what I want to leave you with, because I said the last 3 sentences carry the weight, and they do. And I have been thinking about how to say this since I started talking. In-laws treat marriage like a merger. I treated the divorce like an acquisition. The difference is that in an acquisition, you know going in that the asset will eventually leave your hands. And the question was never whether I would go, but whether I would leave them holding what I had made or take it with me. I took it with me.